Everybody, it is Professor Parrish, and we are on week 9 of English 122. So, as I'm recording this, I've got it pulled up here on Canvas. We're going to look at the module guide and the discussion and the reading a poem quiz and PowerPoint, just kind of based on this new section that we're starting out. So we are moving on from fiction and moving forward into poetry. And I know poetry is often it's not everyone's favorite genre going into of literature. I find that either students really like poetry or they don't like it at all. There's not usually a whole lot of middle ground. And I think one of the reasons of that, I've asked students in the past, why don't you like poetry? And most of them will say because it's hard to understand or it doesn't have a plot. And those are both very valid reasons to not like poetry, because poetry can be very, very abstract. It can be very abstract. It does not have to have a plot. It doesn't really have to have characters. It can be very fluid. It can be very easy to understand, but it can also have multiple meanings, and even the authors themselves may intend for the poem to be ambiguous so that the audience derives their own meaning from it. And for some readers, that's frustrating, because sometimes when you read a story, you want to expect certain things. You expect characters, you expect there to be a plot, you expect it to go certain directions, and even if it doesn't quite go exactly as planned, you do know that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Poetry sometimes doesn't even have a beginning. It just is. And it's just describing an atmosphere or a mood or an emotion. It can be describing a second in time or no time at all. And so it can be very confusing. But I think the great thing about poetry and why so many people do like it is because it's literally literature at its best. And we're going to talk about this in the PowerPoint, but it is basically, if you craft a good poem, you're using literature to its fullest extent. People use poetry a lot of times for therapy in order to get emotions out and to put it on a page. And you don't want to write a novel, but you want to write something. Poetry is a good constructive way of therapeutically getting your emotions out there in the open. It's why lots of people are like, oh, when you were in high school, you wrote poetry. And I was like, yes, because I was an angsty high schooler and I needed to. So we're going to talk about that in this week's PowerPoint. But just to go over the module guide for this week does start on March 13th. So you've had spring break off. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed that week off, got some rest, worked on other things, was able to refresh and get ready for the second half of the semester, if you can believe it. So this does take place March 13th, and then your assignments will be due by Sunday of this week. So in our literature book, we have the reading a poem section from 692 to 706. We're going to look at the PowerPoint for it, and then you have a quiz and the discussion forum. So there is going to be some poetry inserted in the reading assignment for this week. So please take notes of poems that you enjoy, because you're going to have to analyze them for your future essay. But let's talk about the discussion forum for week 9. So you're going to choose a poem that you like and you're going to repost it in this discussion forum. What about this poem speaks to you? Do you agree with what it's saying? So why did you choose this poem? What was the reason behind that? What did it say to you? Why did it call out and say, dear student, I'm short, pick me? That's usually a lot of the reasons why people choose the poems that they do, because they're not long. But poetry itself is typically pretty short. But I want to know, why did you pick this poem? What about it intrigued you? What did you like? And do you agree with what it's trying to say? Or do you even know what it's trying to say? I want you to articulate that in your discussion forum and then respond to 2 peers. So that is the discussion forum. And then obviously we have the reading a poem quiz. I'm not going to click on the link here, but it's basically set up the exact same way our last quizzes have been. It's going to be due Sunday, March 19th. I do want to talk about the reading a poem section of our textbook. And so this PowerPoint is going to be kind of discussing that. So basically, what is a poem? Well, the thing about poetry is it emphasizes meaning and emotion. It's not so much worried about the who and the where. It's more intrigued by the what. And so it usually requires slow and careful reading. So that's the thing about poetry. A lot of people, they want to just breeze through a poem and say, oh, it's about nature. But oftentimes symbolism and imagery is used a lot in poetry. So you need to do a slow, careful reading of it. The good news is most poems are pretty short. So that slow and careful reading is not going to be too long, right? It's not the same thing as reading a short story or a novel. But it can take you time to digest and analyze the poem in what it truly means. So what may not be a poem? Well, any composition of lines that more or less, so basically in a verse, you have a rhythm more or less, and oftentimes it will rhyme. And a verse that isn't poetry usually lacks depth or emotion. So here's the thing. You have open form poetry versus a closed form poem. A closed form poem is what we think of as having like a rhyme scheme or a pattern to it. And then you have open form poetry or free verse that allows you to basically do whatever you want. It doesn't have to rhyme, but it still has to convey that emotionality that a poem should have. So if a poem is just like a story, or if you read a verse of poetry and it just reads like a story, it's probably not a poem. It's probably like a vignette or a piece of flash fiction or something like that. So how do you read a poem? Well, once with no expectations. I like this piece of advice. Just read it once expecting nothing. Read it once at face value and see how it makes you feel. And then the second time you read it, and I do encourage you to read it a second time, go back and read it with a purpose. That purpose can be, okay, I want to find out what this means. Or if the first time you read it, you're like, I think I'm getting some kind of symbolism with anger or happiness, but I'm not sure. Go back and read it a second time and see if you notice any clues that point you to why you thought that. And then you may need to read it additional times for clarity or reflection. Consider reading it aloud. Oftentimes poetry is written to be read aloud. And you'll be surprised when you do so, because when you read a poem out loud, especially if it is closed form and has like a rhythm or a pattern, it oftentimes your mouth and your voice will start to mimic that pattern or rhythm, right? Whether your brain realizes it or not, it will start to do that. And that's a sign of a good rhythm and pattern when it gets your mouth to do that. And then give yourself time to think about it. Like, what did this poem mean? How did I feel about it? What was the author trying to do? Give yourself time to read and think and analyze and reflect. Other ways to engage in poetry is to paraphrase. You can try to put the poem in your own words. That can help you break down the poem and understand it better. Or you could create a summary, which is where you retell what the main purpose of the poem was. Oftentimes, if you don't understand something, putting it into your own words can help you kind of solve and break down what it is about. Theme. Theme is crucial to poetry because oftentimes poetry does have a central thought. It is not necessarily the subject matter. The subject matter can be what the poem is about. This is more what the poem means. And people can view the poem's theme differently. That's probably the big thing about poetry, is that usually with a story, the themes are kind of overarching and easy for the audience to break down. But in a poem, oftentimes authors will make it ambiguous or give the poem multiple meanings. And so it's kind of left up to the audience how they interpret and what they derive from the poem emotionally and how they connect to it. So it can be a lot different than reading a story. And then there are types of poetry. So lyric poetry is probably the one we're most familiar with. It's a short poem that expresses the thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. It can be in first person perspective, but it's not always. And honestly, we see these lyric poems all the time. They're called songs. Anytime you hear a song on the radio, that's usually a lyric poem. If it has words, if it's short, has an emotional force, that is a lyrical poem. So any song that you hear on the radio or on Spotify or whatever, that is a piece of lyric poetry. Then you have narrative poetry. Now this is similar to telling a story, but it's not exactly like a piece of short fiction. So for example, an epic is a long narrative form that often follows a hero. Beowulf, for example, I'm sure many of you read Beowulf in high school. That is actually, in its original translation, a poem. So you may be wondering, well, now wait a minute. Beowulf doesn't always rhyme, so that's a poem. Well, In a lot of English translations, it does not rhyme because when you translate a word into English, you change the meaning and how it's said in the structure. But in its original language, it actually does rhyme and it's a poem. So that's kind of cool, right? Also, you could think of ballads. So, I mean, you could maybe argue that Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin's a ballad. Maybe it's long enough, or Freebird. You could say the same. But when I think of ballad, I think of like in The Hobbit, when the dwarves in The Hobbit come to visit Bilbo Baggins, they sing this big epic ballad that speaks of the narration of their people and of their lands. That is a ballad narrative poetry. That's a perfect example of it. So if you've watched The Hobbit or read it, that big old song that they sing, that is a ballad and it's a form of narrative poetry. Then you have dramatic poetry that presents the voice of an imaginary character, and it's any verse written for the stage. It could be a dramatic monologue where a character speaks, of themselves, and it usually abides by what the character knows, but it can be a form of poetry that a character speaks in a play. This one's probably the least common, but is still one that occurs. Didactic poetry is written to state a message or to teach, and it can impart some moral lesson, usually like a fable or something. Or I usually think of Shel Silverstein. If you've ever read Where the Sidewalk Ends, I love Shel Silverstein and his poetry. It's very kind of weird and quirky and kind of dark humor. Like as a kid, I was like, this is pretty dark. But a lot of his poetry is didactic. Like it teaches a lesson. Even though it is funny or humorous or kind of scary, it's still teaching a lesson within the text. So yeah. So those are the terminology and things to know for this week. As I've said before, if you have any questions about the quiz, about discussion 9, any of that, please let me know. My goal with the poetry unit is not to make you love poetry. Not everybody will, but rather it's to make you appreciate it. If I ask a student at the end of the unit and be like, okay, do you like poetry? They're like, it's still not for me. And I'm like, well, do you appreciate it? And they're like, oh, sure. Then my job is done. So as always, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe. Take care. If you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all again for week 10 of English 122. Bye.